The night Caleb Porter heard a voice say his name through a phone he wasn't supposed to be holding, he understood for the first time the difference between knowing something and finally being allowed to believe it. His name was Caleb. He was 39. He fixed old buildings for a living, structural restorations mostly, the kind of work where you spend your mornings reading the bones of a house and your afternoons deciding which ones are worth saving. He had been divorced for 2 years by then, not bitterly, just quietly, the way some endings go. His ex-wife had been a good woman who wanted a version of him that was more present, and he had been a man who didn't know how to be present until after it mattered. No villain in that story, just a slow, mutual drift, like two boats that untie from the same dock and find they've floated to different channels before either of them thought to check. He wasn't bitter. He was tired in the specific way that comes from spending too long being careful with a life that still felt mostly like scaffolding. He lived in a house in the kind of neighborhood where people still mowed their own lawns and left tomatoes on each other's porches in August. His sister Dana lived 6 blocks away, and Dana's best friend, the one who had been coming and going from their family's orbit since they were all in their 20s, was a woman named Nora. Nora Voss, 41. A freelance illustrator who worked out of a studio in her back bedroom and smelled faintly of cedar pencils and coffee that had been reheated once too many times. She had been briefly engaged 4 years ago to a man named Daniel, who was the kind of smooth that people confuse with reliable until the day they don't. She had called that off herself, quietly and correctly, and had not made a public event of it, which Caleb had always respected without ever saying so. She had warm, specific eyes and a way of saying exactly what she meant while managing to sound like she was still deciding. She had been in Caleb's peripheral vision for 15 years. He had spent most of those 15 years not looking directly at her for reasons he never fully examined. The Saturday this story begins, Caleb was at Dana's kitchen table doing nothing important. Dana had asked him to come by and fix the latch on her back gate, which he had done in 11 minutes, and then somehow it was afternoon, and there was coffee and leftover pastry from somewhere, and Dana was on the phone in the hallway, and Caleb was sitting there with his second mug, listening to rain start up against the window. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and dish soap. The overhead light buzzed faintly. It was the kind of afternoon that existed only to make a person feel the particular sadness of not having anywhere better to be. Dana came back in, her phone still in her hand, and said she had to run to the hardware store and pick up something for the back fence post while she was at it. Caleb told her he'd wait. She dropped her phone on the table because she was also grabbing her keys and her jacket and the list she'd made on a post-it note, and she was out the door before any of them had a chance to arrange themselves properly. The phone buzzed on the table. Caleb glanced at it. The screen said the call with Nora was still connected, 47 seconds in. Not ended, just running. He should have pressed the red button and set it back down. He knew that. But before he could reach for it, he heard Nora's voice through the small speaker, tinny and quiet, saying, "Dana, you still there?" A pause. Then, "Okay, I can hear you breathing or something, so I'm just going to keep talking." Caleb went very still. He did not pick the phone up. He didn't set it down either. He just sat there with his coffee and became, without intending to, an accidental witness. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Nora's voice continued, "about Caleb, and I think you're right, and I hate that you're right because it would have been much easier if you were wrong." A short laugh, the self-deprecating kind. "I've been doing that thing where I make it logical, like he's your brother so it's complicated, or he just got out of a marriage and the last thing he needs is someone who's also still putting herself back together." A pause, and Caleb heard the soft sound of a chair scraping tile somewhere on her end. "But honestly, Dana, the real reason I haven't said anything is because I'm terrified that if I say it out loud and it goes wrong, I lose something it's been part of my life for a long time, and I don't know how to need something and risk it at the same time." The rain came a little harder against the kitchen window. The light buzzed. Caleb sat with both hands around his mug and felt something shift in his chest with the slow, irreversible certainty of a load-bearing wall finally deciding where it stood. Then Nora said quietly, to what she believed was an empty line, "I like him. I've liked him for a while, and I don't know what to do with that." The call dropped at 50 seconds after that, likely when Dana walked into the hardware store and her signal went. Caleb set the phone down on the table, exactly where Dana had left it, and looked at his own hands for a moment. He did not smile. He did not do anything dramatic. He poured out the last of his coffee, rinsed the mug, and stood at the sink watching the rain move through the garden. Sometimes careful is just fear with better manners. He had been careful for 2 years. He had been careful in a marriage, and careful afterward, and careful every single time Nora had been in a room with him. He was tired of being the kind of careful that had started to look, from the outside, like not caring at all. Dana came back 20 minutes later, dropped a bag on the counter, picked up her phone without looking at it, and said, "You want to stay for dinner? Nora's coming by around 6. Caleb said he'd stay for dinner. Nora arrived at 6 with a bottle of red wine and a paper bag from the good Italian place on the corner. She was wearing a gray pullover with a small smear of burnt orange paint near the left cuff that she either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing. Her hair was clipped up in the particular way it went when she'd been working, the kind of updo that wasn't meant to be an updo. She set the bag down, said something to Dana about the pasta being the right kind this time, and then looked up and saw Caleb at the kitchen table and said, "Oh, you're here." "Fix the gate latch," he said. "That latch has been broken since March," Dana said from the counter. "Well," Nora said, "better late than a structural collapse." She was looking at Caleb when she said it. He held the eye contact for exactly 1 beat longer than he normally would have, and she noticed, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was practicing to be one. Dinner was easy in the way that evenings are easy when 3 people have known each other long enough to stop performing. Dana talked about the fence post and a neighbor who had opinions about property lines, and Nora talked about a project she was finishing for a children's book about a lighthouse keeper, and Caleb listened and contributed and felt, the whole time, like a man holding a card he hadn't decided whether to play. Then Dana got a call from her upstairs tenant about a thermostat, said she'd be right back, and went up the interior stairs, and the kitchen went quiet except for the rain still tapping at the window and the low sound of a song Dana had on from a small Bluetooth speaker on the counter. Nora refilled her glass and said without looking up, "You've been strange tonight." "Strange how?" Caleb said. "Quieter than usual, which is saying something." She finally looked up. "Did something happen?" He considered the various answers available to him and chose the honest one. "Dana left her phone on the table this afternoon." A pause, small, precise, and full of recognition. Nora set her glass down. "How long?" "Long enough." She didn't look away. He expected some version of embarrassment, a flush, a deflection, a pivot to something that would let them both pretend the moment hadn't arrived. What he got instead was Nora Voss looking at him with a steadiness that he recognized from 15 years of watching her be exactly who she was, even when it would have been simpler not to be, and she said, "Well, that's inconvenient." "Is it?" he said. "I had a whole plan," she said, dry as wood smoke. "I was going to wait until I felt slightly more like a person who had their life arranged properly, and then I was going to, I don't know, do something subtle and vague and give you an opportunity to not notice it if you didn't want to." "That's a very bad plan," Caleb said. "I know that now." Her fingers traced the base of her wine glass. "I've known it for about 6 months, honestly." He looked at her. She looked back. The speaker on the counter played something low and unhurried. Outside, the rain had gone to a drizzle, and somewhere down the street a dog was making a sincere objection to something. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," he said. "But," she said, "but I've been careful for a long time, and I'm starting to think careful's just a word I've been using for something else." She tilted her head. "What's the other word?" "Scared," he said, for the record. Something in her face settled. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition. The specific kind that comes when you've been carrying something alone for a while, and someone finally picks up the other end. "Okay," she said. "Me too. We've established that." A pause. "So, what do we do with it?" He said, "I think we stop pretending we don't know." She looked at him for a long moment. Dana's footsteps were audible on the stairs above them, 2 floors up, buying them perhaps another 40 seconds. Nora said, quietly and without drama, "I'd really like to go get coffee with you sometime. Just us, without a gate latch as the reason." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Dana came back into the kitchen saying the thermostat was a non-event and asked if anyone wanted more pasta, and both of them said yes please, and the evening continued as evenings do when something has been quietly and permanently rearranged inside of it. 3 weeks later, they were standing in the middle of a Saturday farmer's market when a man named Daniel appeared at the edge of the cheese stall. He was tall and pressed and wearing the specific kind of weekend casual that required effort to look effortless, and he saw Nora first and made a beeline with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told, in a way that reached him, that a door was closed. "Nora," he said, and then his eyes moved to Caleb, in the way eyes move when they're filing information. "I didn't know you were seeing someone." I didn't know I needed to report it, she said. Daniel smiled at Caleb with the sociable and slightly diminishing warmth of a man who has decided he's the more impressive person in the exchange. Daniel, I'm an old friend. Caleb said. He shook the hand. He did not squeeze too hard or not hard enough. He was pleasant and even and gave Daniel nothing. We were engaged, Daniel said to Caleb, in the way some men say things to the person who matters least to the information. A few years back. But Nora's always known what she wanted. He said it with the cadence of a man who meant to imply she did not. Caleb looked at him with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has spent 20 years reading structures and knows exactly which ones are hollow. She does, actually, Caleb said. That's probably the thing I like most about her. Daniel's smile held, but the warmth went out of it. He said something about catching up, said it was good to see her, and was gone inside a minute. Nora watched him go, and then looked at Caleb with an expression he was learning to read, the one that meant she was filing something away to reference later with good comic timing. Well, she said. He seemed great, Caleb said. She started laughing before she could help it. The real kind, not the polished kind. And she put her hand on his arm to steady herself and left it there after she'd stopped laughing, which was its own answer to a question neither of them had phrased out loud. 5 months after the farmer's market, and 8 months after that kitchen table, Caleb was sitting at his own kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with the back door open and the smell of October coming through. Dry leaves, somebody's wood smoke, the particular cold that means the season has finally decided. Nora was at the counter making tea she had decided at some point she was allowed to make without asking, which he found unreasonably satisfying as a development. She was still in the pullover she'd worn to her studio, different paint mark this time, cobalt blue near the elbow, and her hair was down and slightly crooked from being clipped up all day. She brought 2 mugs to the table and sat across from him and said, I talked to Dana today. I know, he said. She called me to tell me you talked to her. Nora wrapped both hands around her mug. She cried a little. She was always going to cry a little, Caleb said. She's been quietly furious at both of us for 6 years. Fairly, Nora allowed. She looked at him over the steam rising from her mug. Outside, a leaf came loose from the maple in the backyard and crossed the square of light from the open door and was gone. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want to say it properly this time. Not through a phone I forgot to hang up. He waited. I have been, at various points in my adult life, afraid of a lot of things, she said. The wrong relationships, the right ones, starting over, not starting over, making the careful choice and living with what that costs. She paused. I'm not afraid of this. Of you. I wanted you to know that I know the difference. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and turned her left-hand palm up and set it there open and placed his hand over it, easy and certain. I know, he said. I know you know. She turned her hand and held his. Outside, the wood smoke came through on the cool air. The kettle she'd already emptied was cooling on the counter, ticking slightly as metal does. There was no drama in it. There was just the specific warmth of a Wednesday evening in October when 2 people who had taken longer than necessary to arrive at a table had finally decided to sit down and stay. 14 months after that, Caleb took Nora to the cabin his grandfather had left him, the one on the creek in the hill country that smelled of old cedar and had a lamp by the window that threw amber across the floorboards in the evening. He had been restoring it slowly, the way he did everything, reading the bones first, deciding what was worth saving. The creek was running well, and the lamp was on, and Nora was sitting on the porch step in a flannel shirt that was technically his, and he came out with 2 bottles of cold beer and sat beside her, and they listened to the water for a while without filling it with anything. He had the ring in his jacket pocket, the one he'd had made by a jeweler in town using a piece of antique brass hardware he'd pulled from a restoration job that Nora had once pointed at in his workshop and said she'd never seen anything that color before. She had said it the way she said things she meant, without knowing she was saying them. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't that kind of man, and she wasn't that kind of woman, and the evening didn't need one. He just reached into his pocket and set the ring on the porch rail between them, and let it sit there in the lamplight, and said, "The color you liked." She looked at it. She looked at him. The creek ran below them, and an owl somewhere started its business, and the lamp held. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." And then, because she was Nora, "You could have told me you were going to do this. You would have planned a whole speech," he said. "I had thoughts," she said. "Tell me the thoughts," he said. And she did. They were married the following June in the backyard of Dana's house, the one with the gate that had a new latch, On an evening when the string lights were strung between the fence posts and the fire pit was going and there were mismatched chairs on the grass and the smell of cedar and warm air and someone's good cooking coming through from the kitchen. Dana cried the appropriate amount. A man from Caleb's crew gave a toast that was 2 sentences long and entirely correct. And Nora Voss, who had become Nora Porter at a courthouse earlier that week without telling anyone because she liked the idea of having it be theirs before it was anyone else's, stood in the backyard in a cream dress and looked at Caleb across the firelight with the same steadiness she had looked at him across Dana's kitchen table, the look that meant she knew exactly what she was choosing. He held it. He didn't look away. He had stopped being careful in the fearful sense of the word. He was still careful in the other sense, the one that means you know what you have and you hold it without squeezing. Sometimes the thing you've been afraid to risk is the same thing you've been carrying closest. The bravest thing Caleb Porter ever did was sit at a kitchen table, hear something he wasn't supposed to hear, and instead of stepping back from it, decide, quietly, finally, without any drama, that this time he would move toward it. Now, what would you have done if you'd been sitting at that table and heard that call? Would you have set the phone down and said nothing? Or would you have found a way to let her know? And have you ever had someone in your life, someone right there, within reach, that you kept telling yourself the timing wasn't right for? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.